Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying this series on underwater composition. Today we're going to talk about 6 different ways that we can convey a sense of depth in our otherwise two-dimensional underwater images. So thanks for tuning in and let's check it out. Photography is really only a two-dimensional medium. However, we can use elements of composition to convey a sense of depth and dimension in our images. In my mind, there are 6 different ways to convey a sense of distance and dimension and depth in your images. 1, we can convey this by portraying multiple layers, showing objects which our mind perceives are close, like the seagrass and angelfish in the foreground, more middle distance, like the vertical pillars behind the fish, and at greater distance, like the undersurface of the water above and the blue water background. A second way to create an illusion of 3 dimensions is to demonstrate apparent size disparity of objects of known size across an image, closer to more distant. This wide-angle image conveys depth by simply showing 3 different divers at a close, intermediate, and far distance. The obvious difference in the size of the divers conveys this without any other visual clues or aids. In the close focus wide-angle video series earlier in my tutorials, we learned how using a wide-angle lens and getting close to the object in the foreground exaggerates the relative size of near objects compared to more distant objects. If we are generally aware of the approximate sizes of various objects, then a sense of depth is portrayed or even exaggerated. I have a feeling that we know the octopus in the foreground here is not really larger than the diver in the background. Therefore, a sense of distance and dimension is created with this image. Here's another example with the scorpionfish in the foreground, which seems to be the same size or even larger than the diver at a further distance behind it. Remember, a wide-angle lens makes all objects appear smaller and more distant, but it exaggerates diminution of size with increasing distance. This is called size perspective distortion. Therefore, it's important to get close to the object in the foreground. We spoke about this a little in the earlier Get Close episode. Also, check out the earlier videos on close focus wide angle for much more information and demonstrations of size, perspective, and other examples. A wide-angle lens has excellent apparent depth of field, especially if we keep our aperture on the smaller side. Here are the large nails or spikes in the foreground, and the much smaller appearing divers in the distant background create, again, a sense of depth and dimension. In this image, the boats in the distant background are much smaller than the diver in the foreground, at the lower part of the image in this split level. In the line episode, we already demonstrated how, among other things, line can be used to portray depth by converging, as seen here on this wreck as the lines converge with increasing distance, or as seen here with the converging mangrove roots leading us up to Snell's window, through which we can see trees and parts of our huts in the sky topside. Another important way to convey a feeling of distance in 3 dimensions is to demonstrate loss of contrast, color, or focus across the image with increasing distance. Now notice the stark change in contrast between the more near and distant objects in this wreck. We feel like we are looking deep inside the wreck. Here's another example of the fading wreck, loss of contrast as distance increases from the right side of the image to the left side, conveying depth. Distance and dimension can also be conveyed by loss of color, as seen here, where the bright orange color in the close foreground leads to a more colorless diver and background in the distance. In addition to the loss of contrast or color, increasing distance can also be portrayed by loss of focus across distance, as seen here in this image of a goby on a brain coral, which becomes more blurred as the coral recedes into the background. And we can further exaggerate loss of focus with distance by opening our aperture, as in this image of the goby, where only the eyes in the foreground are tack sharp and everything else in the distance between becomes increasingly blurred. Now, we've discussed other ways to convey depth and distance. Another one to do is to use overlap. But we have to be a little careful about this. On an upcoming juxtaposition video, I'm going to specifically emphasize how it's often good to avoid so-called mergers because they can negatively affect our composition. but sometimes we can show overlap to convey depth. Here the giant plumose anemones are in front of and behind this diver in Seattle. The spines of a sea urchin are in front of and behind this crab, thus conveying some depth even in this macro shot, which has otherwise very limited depth of field. Finally, a sixth way to convey depth and dimension in our images is by finding objects that have an irregular or textured surface and illuminating them with our strobe at an acute angle from above or the side. We can emphasize texture, shadow, and topography. By zooming in on this surface, we can make it seem as if the photograph lives in 3 dimensions. Look at the difference in this subject when the strobe faces the subject straight on, as shown here, versus at an acute angle from the side. Look at how much more depth and dimension is shown here. Texture in 3 dimensions are emphasized by highlighting the wrinkles on the skin around the eye of this porcupine fish. Hopefully we can see texture here on the wrinkles in the neck of this turtle. Topography was emphasized by the shadows when the strobe was again positioned at an acute angle on this coral. And the strobe positioning here caused heavy shadows, creating a sense of dimensions and making this potentially boring subject more interesting. This is one of my favorite images. I think it conveys depth, distance, and dimension with several of the methods already outlined in this video. One is loss of contrast with distance. The large wreck beneath this diver fades from right to left as the depth and distance increases. Loss of contrast is further highlighted by the well-defined diver at center compared with the much more faded wreck and everything else in the image beneath her. Additional depth is created by the leading line of the rope and the converging lines of the wreck beneath the diver. And finally, we see size difference. Note the much smaller size of the divers on the wreck compared with the large diver in the center of the image. To me, the tremendous feeling of depth is what makes this image compelling. So there you have it, 6 ways to create a sense of depth and dimension in your images. Show multiple layers, show size disparity across distance, use converging lines, demonstrate loss of color, contrast, or focus across distance, show overlap, and finally bring out shadows, texture, and topography. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this helpful.